It is called Israel. To be or not to be. Even today, it is still an issue. Israel, to be or not to be. The United Nations, Gaza.
Shocked.
Is adopted.
Continuous reports on a catastrophe.
If there is a hell on earth today, its name is Northern Gaza.
The Israel Defense Forces and continued bombardment are hitting civilians, hospitals, refugee camps, mosques, church, and UN facilities, including shelters.
But UN reports have no importance whatsoever for Israel.
Trusting the reports coming out of Gaza is exactly like trusting reports from ISIS.
This report.
That is why a humanitarian crisis means nothing to the Zionists.
In Gaza is more than a humanitarian crisis. It is a crisis of humanity.
In Gaza, and we know that there is no humanitarian crisis.
Even when the UN General Assembly condemns Israel by a large majority vote.
Is adopted.
I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Israel ignores it completely.
The UN no longer holds even 1 ounce of legitimacy.
Antonio Guterres defines the October 7th war within the context of Palestine's occupation.
The attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation.
But Guterres faces a shocking response.
The Secretary General must resign.
However, such reactions are common by Israel because it sees no reason for the presence of the United Nations.
There's no justification to the existence of this building.
As a result, it wouldn't be a surprise to see a record in murdering UN staff by Israel.
Our colleagues have lost their lives in Gaza. This is the highest number of aid workers killed in the history of our organization.
The bitter fact that we are facing today is that the UN is not capable of putting an end to the tragedy of Palestine. The last thing it can do is to condemn. The Zionists cannot even stand verbal disagreement. UN's final legal obligation is issued through UN Security Council resolutions. But a resolution against Israel will be vetoed.
Those against? Those against?
The United States has nearly vetoed all UN resolutions against Israel.
There's always the Israeli exception. Almost every law that comes, every resolution.
Even if a resolution is adopted, nothing will happen. Israel is subject to the highest number of resolutions. This is while there have been no resolutions against Palestine.
How many times has the UN General Assembly passed resolutions condemning Israel?
There have been hundreds over.
Hundreds?
Last year, yeah.
Hundreds, yeah. And every year probably at least double digits, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And how many against the Palestinian Authority?
The Palestinian Authority is never condemned at the
Never?
United Nations. No.
Israel holds a world record of not adhering to any UN resolutions.
The Israelis are not going to abide by this UN Security Council resolution.
A meaningless piece of paper.
We've had endless Security Council resolutions against Israel.
Yet, no resolution has come into effect for putting an end to occupation and genocide in Palestine.
The Palestinian people, we are still living under occupation, and that resolution has not been implemented.
The only result has been a failure for the United Nations.
The UN is failing or failed.
But why has the UN been so ineffective against Israel? Like any other development, the reasons have historical roots. On November 29, 1947, Resolution 181 was ratified after continuous lobbying by the Zionists with the United States and Britain. A resolution which split Palestine, preparing the ground for the formation of Israel.
It was a General Assembly resolution that partitioned Palestine and set up the Israeli state. So,
lobbying efforts by the US and Britain were completed after the ratification of Resolution 273 on May 11, 1949, using influence on the United Nations for the recognition of Israel.
by the lobby, through the US, came in and badgered the Europeans into accepting Israel as a sort of associate member.
In fact, it was the West which used the United Nations as a tool to create Israel.
The way the United Nations, the way the Western powers behaved in 1947, in the de facto, not explicit, but the implicit creation of the Israeli state.
Forced immigration, the use of military threats, and imposing resolutions on the United Nations by the US and Britain.
Israel can never get clear title of Jerusalem or the occupied territories without a UN say-so.
Israel, the offspring of resolutions.
Israel is the only state that was actually created by a UN resolution.
It is interesting that even today, the existence of Israel is still tied to this issue, this time in a reverse process. Apparently, the UN Security Council's current mechanism is a threat which limits Israel, but in reality, all these resolutions are vetoed. Or even if ratified, they have no impact on the world order created by the United States.
The Council has one standing agenda, and that's Israel.
As long as Israel is backed by the US and powerful lobbies, UN efficiency will have no meaning.
Really believing that in the 21st century it is acceptable to ignore the international law in such a way, to ignore the international institutions, and to rely only on the United States. And there is a very, very clear international law. But for most of the Israelis, international law is very important. But not for Israel. Israel is a special case.
As long as the US is 100% behind Israel, and as long as the lobby keeps it that way, then the UN is never going to be a functioning entity.
The United Nations is defined in the world of Israel.
Mr. Secretary General, in what world do you live?
A world in which the UN is like Netanyahu's private property.